very lucky to have this author with us tonight. Welcome and good evening, everyone, to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Deborah Tannen. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I will also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. I'm thrilled to remind you all that all 9 of our stores are currently open for both inside service and curbside pickup. And also we have a brand new store in Napa that is really beautiful. So check it out when you can. One little thing, as I'm sure many of you can attest to, COVID-19 has been extremely tough on all small businesses and in particular indie bookstores like us. So as such, I really wanted to take a moment tonight and thank you all for your continued support. Your support allows us to continue to provide these free events, and for that we are grateful, so thank you. A couple of housekeeping items before I introduce Deborah. We will be using the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, links to purchase Deborah's brand new title, which is her 13th book, as well as a 10% discount code for use on our website. I will also include links to purchase her previous works, which are New York Times bestsellers, so they're all really great. And we'll also include my contact details for post-event information. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to tonight with any questions or comments for the speaker. The format will feature around 30 to 45 minutes of speaking, and then will be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. Please go ahead and submit your questions and comments here rather than replying to the chat box, and we really appreciate you doing that. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's author, Deborah Tannen. Deborah is the acclaimed author of You Just Don't Understand, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 4 years. The New York Times bestseller, You're Wearing That, about mothers and daughters, which I read, my mom read, so great. And You Were Always Mom's Favorite, about sisters. As I mentioned, she's written many other books. She's a university professor and professor of linguistics at Georgetown University and appears frequently on national television and radio. Deborah currently lives with her husband in the Washington, D.C. area. So she is with us tonight to discuss her brand new title, Finding My Father, his century-long journey from World War I Warsaw and my quest to follow. So I'm really excited to have you here with us this evening and to learn how this book came about and, what the process taught you. And I'm sure, everyone here is as well. So why don't you go ahead and take it away for us, Deborah?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. I hope you're all doing okay in this very strange and challenging time, as witness the fact that we're meeting this way and not in person, which I would have so loved to do. Yeah, so the book I'm talking about today is different from any other book I've written. It's more personal. It took me way longer to write. When just not all that long ago, the box arrived with the first bound copies of the book. And as I was opening the package, I realized that my heart was pounding and my hands were almost shaking. And I was so excited and realized that I hadn't felt that way opening my first carton of first hardbound books since the very first book that I wrote. And that was 1984. Why? Why is it so important to me? And why did I write a book that was so different? In a way, I have 3 answers, 3 levels of answer to that. One, I guess, I think of as historical, one personal, and the third one is about my parents' marriage. So let me just say a couple words about each of those and then talk more about the specifics in the book. Historical, and the subtitle of the book is, I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong at all. My father's century-long journey from World War I Warsaw. And then the personal will be the next part, my quest to follow. My father's life spanned the entire 20th century. And it reflected and was affected by all the cataclysmic events especially from the perspective of an East European Jewish immigrant to the United States. So he was born in 1908 into a Hasidic household in Warsaw. That's ultra-Orthodox Jewish sect, Hasidism, which was the major sect for Eastern European Jews at that time, especially in Poland. He came to this country in 1920. He was 12, came with his mother and sister. His father had died when he was very young. And I didn't understand the significance of all of these things until I started talking to him at length when he was older and reading about the era. I knew it was unusual that my father and my mother also, that they were born in Europe. Most people my age had grandparents born in Europe. He came in 1920. That was the last year there were no limits on immigration from Eastern Europe. And it was an era of tremendous anti-immigrant sentiment. And that led to something like the 1920 version of the wall. In 1921, Congress imposed quotas, and in 1924, the quotas were so draconian that the door basically slammed shut to Eastern European and Southern European immigrants. It was really aimed at keeping out the Italians, the Greeks, and especially the Eastern European Jews. He came to this country when he was 12. At 14, he quit high school, went to work full-time in the garment district, as so many Eastern European Jews did at the time. And yet he became a lawyer. So maybe I can say a little bit later about how he did that. But he passed the bar and got his master's degree in law in the Depression. And that affected his life tremendously. He was a communist. I have his FBI file. But he did eventually start his own law firm. It was the largest workers' compensation law firm in New York, and he liked to say, and therefore the world. And he ran for Congress on the Liberal Party ticket, which is a New York State party. So just seeing how his life was really a walking tour through history, and the amazing things he had accomplished was one of my original reasons for wanting to write this book. But then there's also the personal reason. When I was a child, he was almost never home, and I missed him. I longed for him. After he retired at 70, he had time, and he loved talking about his past. And I loved having time with him. Once I decided that I was going to write this book about him, I'm kind of a workaholic. I was able to actually take hours and hours out in the middle of the day to talk to him. And it was almost as if writing this book was a way of making up for all that time and filling that really, what felt in some ways like maybe a hole in my heart that I had missed him all those years. So that's the personal. And then what about my parents' marriage? Both my parents talked about a woman that my father might have married instead of my mother. I'm going to call her Helen. That's a pseudonym. At one point, my father said to me when we were talking about his past, he was talking about his past, and I referred to my mother as his other girlfriend, and he said, "Your mother wasn't my girlfriend. Helen was my girlfriend." So why did he marry my mother and not Helen? And I will talk about that later this evening. So those were some of the mysteries and challenges and questions that I wanted to deal with in writing this book. I never read from books. I always just talk. And I often say that I envy fiction writers because they get to read from their books. Somebody that interviewed me the other day told me that when he interviews novelists, he has them read. When he interviews nonfiction authors, he doesn't. But he said, this book kind of reads like a novel. And so he asked me to read the beginning, and I thought, it kind of worked nicely to set the stage. So I'm going to be doing that right now. And don't worry, it's only about a little over a minute. It's not a long reading. but it's how the book begins. I adored my father. He's the parent I felt an affinity with, the one I thought understood me. I traced to him my love of words, of language, of reading, and of writing. When my father was home, he was often sitting at his desk, writing. That remained his favorite place to be, his favorite thing to do, until he died 2 weeks before his 98th birthday. I don't know if I was emulating him or expressing the genes he passed on, but when I was a child, the object I loved most was an old black manual typewriter with yellowing keys rimmed in tarnished silver. I typed poems and stories and letters to my father, telling him what happened to me during the day, often laying out grievances against my mother. I talked to my father through letters because when I was growing up, he was rarely home. The strongest presence I felt in the house was his absence. A sense of yearning for him stayed with me long after I was grown. And that really was a feeling that stayed with me well into my adulthood. I often dreamed about my father, and more often than not in my dreams, he wasn't paying attention to me, and I would try to reach him and couldn't get to him. One in particular has always stuck in my mind. It must have been in my early 30s when I had this dream, but it was so vivid and it remained with me. I'm having a birthday party, and my father's there, but he's floating somewhere in his own world with his head up near the ceiling and his feet several feet off the floor. And I don't know what he's doing up there. He doesn't really seem to be doing anything, but I try to get him to come down, and I can't. He doesn't seem to see me, and he doesn't seem to hear me. He's just stuck up there, and I can't get his attention. And that kind of crystallized, I would say, for me, how I felt about him as a child, and really until he retired and I started having the opportunity to spend so much time with him as I was planning this book. Now, I should say he retired in 1979, and it's rather later than that now. And I said how long it took me to write this book. I got very serious about writing it in the mid-1990s, but then didn't really write the first draft until about 8 years ago. And then I wrote another book in between, the last book about women friends, I called You're the Only One I Can Tell. But it does go that far back. That image of me as a little girl sitting at a typewriter writing him letters, it kind of crystallizes, use that word again, the role of writing, I think, in both our lives. My father kept correspondences and wrote very long letters to people all over the world. It occurred to me once, I thought about it this way. My father spoke Polish, Yiddish, English, and he read Hebrew, but his native language was writing. I think that's where he felt most comfortable, and that's where he felt that he could express himself. Often, this is throughout our lives, I might be with him and he wouldn't say something about something, and I would think he had no thoughts about it, and then he would go and write a letter and send it. When he was 70, when he was 70, he learned to use a computer, and so that made it a lot easier for him to write these long letters. And when he was 80, he learned to use email, and then he started writing me long emails. It was from my father that I learned the habit of always having a dictionary nearby. So if you were reading something or even in the middle of a conversation and a word appeared that you either weren't sure of its meaning or its pronunciation, you just stopped what you were doing, went across the room and checked it in the dictionary. Now, of course, the dictionary is in my phone like everything else, and that's much more convenient. But, in a funny way, when I walked across the room to the dictionary, I always felt somehow my father was walking with me. So although it's convenient now to just pull out my phone, I really miss that walk across the room, missing him at that moment. My father left me mountains of written words. He saved, I think, every piece of paper that came into his life. And so there were every letter he had received, copies of many letters that he wrote, notes that he took on many occasions. And when he realized that I was writing about his life, he started writing down memories for me and sending them. He handed me journals that he had kept before he was married when he was 18, 19, 20. I was actually, it was one of the afternoons in the mid 90s. I was talking to him, and he reached into the drawer in his desk where there are files, and he pulled out two old journals. And he explained that these were these journals he had kept when he was young. And he said, "You can have this one now." And he handed it to me. And he said, "This one will be here. You can have it when I'm gone." Of course, I was quite intrigued to know what was in that one. He ended up giving me that one too, and told me what was in it so that I wouldn't be too surprised when I read it. So he wanted me to know everything, and he wrote something in one of the letters he wrote to me about my writing this book. He said, "If you write it while I'm alive, you'll have to be worrying about my feelings." And when I read that, came across that later, and after he was gone, and I thought, I'm still worrying about his feelings, but I'm thinking about it because I want to know what they were that led up to and resulted from all these things in his life. When my father retired at 70, he got a big notebook and started writing about his life. He started by writing down all the jobs that he had held, and it came to 68. What fascinated me on one level was, why did he start by writing his jobs? And then he set about describing every one. And he remembered all of them. He was telling about, and he did this either as many of them in writing and many he recorded. Gave him a tape recorder and cassette tapes. And by the way, I have 200 cassette tapes of interviews with him and conversations with him. Again, this mountain of words that I was left with. So he wrote down scenes and who he had worked with in all these jobs. And I realized that he regarded this list of jobs as a summary of his life. When I thought about his life, I thought about his relationships. And as I said, who he married and how he came to that decision to get married. But he thought of his life as the work that he did, the effort that he put into finding the jobs, doing the jobs. And I think he saw the great number that there were 68, on the one hand, as something he regretted, the result of, in some cases, bad decisions, and in most cases, bad luck, and the overwhelming reason, the depression, that he had to do so many different kinds of work before he finally could earn his living as a lawyer. He was 19 when he finished law school, and only 2 years later that he got a master's degree in law and passed the bar. But he also was proud. It also gave him a sense of satisfaction that he did whatever he had to do to support his family. And I realized, again, much of what I ended up doing in writing the book was thinking about how his life was similar to mine, how it was different from mine, how he had influenced me, how much of what I am doing is his legacy, and also some of the ways that our lives were so different. And this was one that it really struck me. Throughout my life, I thought about what I wanted to do. The only question my father ever asked was what he had to do. I don't think he ever asked himself what he wanted to do. And so that he had had all these different jobs was evidence that he had done what he had to do. Now, what were all these jobs? my first draft of the book, which I think I wrote way back in 2012, um, I listed a lot of these jobs and talked about all of them and what they meant to him and retold some of these fascinating stories about them. But then I realized you all, as readers, probably don't want to read about 68 jobs. So I ended up writing about only a few and the ones that were most important, but a few that really jumped out at me. And one thing in particular that jumped out at me, my father, in describing one of his jobs, wrote, "I gripped the gun I had hard and waited." My father gripping a gun, he was, many people thought of him as a gentle giant. Um, he was an alcohol tax inspector, which meant he was chasing bootleggers during Prohibition. And so he had a gun, and that scene was where he was watching somebody they suspected to be a bootlegger through the night. He had gone into an apartment, and they thought if he came out with large quantities of sugar, that would be evidence against him. He did spend the whole night and didn't come out with any sugar. My father wrote in his description, it turned out he was there for sweets of another kind. The job I will say most about is one that kind of encapsulated for him and for the family his biggest regret. And regret was a theme, and sadly a major theme in his life, and therefore in my sense of life growing up as well. And that was a job as a prison guard. Now, it wasn't the job that he regretted, it was the fact that he gave it up. But how did my father come to be a prison guard? During the Depression, he, like so many other people, took endless civil service exams. And one of them was a federal civil service exam that resulted in his being offered a job as a guard at the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. It was a minimum security federal prison. Incidentally, it's where conscientious objectors were sent. The poet Robert Lowell was a prisoner there when he was there. Not that he ever mentioned that, but the years match up. So he was certainly not the kind of job he ever thought he would take, but he took it. And it turned out to be, really, the family thought of it as a kind of Garden of Eden. He liked the work, but even more than that, I think they liked the life that came with it. At this point, it was my father, my mother, my oldest sister, Naomi, who was a little girl at the time, and my mother's mother, who lived with them. They had a house. They didn't live in an apartment. They all talked about how much they loved having a yard with a weeping willow tree. Always mentioned the weeping willow tree. And they had a community. Other New York Jews who had gotten the jobs the same way he did, they had good friends and were part of a community. He talked about riding to work. To save gas, they would go all together. And my parents remained friends with many of those people, even much later. I came to understand, and it's kind of like a side point later, how much this idea of a community was meaningful to my father, because his memories of his childhood in Warsaw were, above all, sense of being part of a community, a large household that he was part of. Again, I'll mention more about that in a minute. And the Jewish community the street he lived in was right in the middle of that Jewish community of Warsaw, and he lost that when he came to this country, as many immigrants do when they leave their homes. So they were very happy there. Why did he leave? He had taken many other civil service exams. One of them resulted in his being contacted again, and they offered him this job as alcohol tax inspector. It was supposed to be New Haven. It ended up being Providence, Rhode Island. And it offered a bit more money, and he felt he had to do it. He's supporting his family, the prison guard salary, and he had been promoted to parole officer, but even that job as parole officer just didn't pay that enough. He was doing all kinds of work on the side to earn more money, And so this was a bit more money, and he decided to take it. He went to see the warden in Danbury and told him that he had been offered this job and was going to take it. The warden was beside himself. He tried everything he could to talk my father out of leaving. He said, "You are doing such good work. You are going to be a warden. You will be a warden in a year." And my father didn't believe it because he said, there are no Jewish wardens. There is no way a Jew will be a warden. The warden said, "Well, that's because there haven't been any Jews in the system. But now there are, that is not going to be a problem. I'm going to recommend you for that position." My father believed that he would recommend him, but he didn't believe that the higher up would approve the appointment. And he went ahead and took the job and went to Providence, Rhode Island. For various reasons, that didn't work out, but the job was okay, but I didn't particularly like it, but it was okay. And he did well in that job as too. But my mother became pregnant with their third child. That was me. And she didn't want to have a child in Providence. They had no friends there. Their family was far away from Providence to New York City. They still thought of New York City as home, and she wanted to go home to have this baby. So you can imagine I felt kind of guilty about that it was my fault that they went back to New York. When you hear what happened there, you'll know why. They went back to New York, and my father, again, was out of work. He took a job as a cutter in a coat factory. It was supposed to be a stopgap measure. He became active in Liberal Party politics. He had long since been disillusioned with communism. He quit the Communist Party in 1939 when Stalin made a pact with Hitler, as many others did. But he became active in Liberal Party politics, which was a party somewhat left of the Democrats, and they held the balance of power. And he was promised, if you become active in this party, you'll be a judge in a year. Okay, a year as a cutter, and then he'll be a judge. Well, next year you'll be a judge. You'll be a judge the year after that. Well, wait till the election. After the election, it was 13 years. 13 years that he worked as a cutter. And only a year after he left the prison and was back in New York, they went back to visit their friends in Danbury, Connecticut. The friend who had been given his job as parole officer when he left it, a year after that, was made warden. And that friend was Jewish. So all those years working in the factory as a cutter, he realized the terrible mistake he had made. Now, of course, I don't know whether I would have still been born or would even be here if he had done that, but that feeling that he had made this terrible mistake was like a shadow over our household. My father never complained. He didn't directly complain about being a cutter. I didn't pick up any negative feelings about the fact that he worked in a factory. But I did sense that he had made this terrible mistake. And I think I inherited that, in many ways that I, throughout the book, think about how things that happened in his life affected mine. And one is that I have a tremendous tendency to regret decisions and to worry about making decisions. I know that's not that unusual, but I think that did have something to do with it. So the first 13 years of my life, till I was in junior high, my father was a cutter. But then after those 13 years, he did get a political appointment as assistant counsel to the Workmen's Compensation Board. And his life changed. I kind of missed it. I loved his calloused hands. The picture of me and my father on the book, I love the fact that you see how big, I don't know if you can see it here in the picture, his big hands. I love that. His big calloused hands that I thought was so, made it like a safe house around my little one when I was a kid. So his hands got softer, and he was no longer getting up so early in the morning, and he was still coming home late because he was working late at the office. But after 6 months, a Republican was elected governor of New York, and he lost the job. Everybody thought he was going to have to just go back to being a cutter, but at that point, he, in his words, as he told me about it later, decided he would move heaven and earth, and he was able to establish practice as a workman's compensation lawyer. And my mother went to work at that point for the first time. So for the last 20 years of his working life, he was a lawyer, and in that sense was a happy ending. He also ran for Congress on the Liberal Party ticket. There was no chance he would win, but I certainly got a kick out of his running. I think I was about 12 when the first time he ran for Congress, and loved going out with him. And he would talk from the back of a truck. And I remember in one case in Coney Island, a little old woman with a coat on, she showed me she had a picture of Franklin Roosevelt in her pocket, told me proudly she had voted for him every time that he ran, and I told her proudly that that candidate was my father. The story of how he got to this point, in my view, it's an immigrant story. And in many ways, the opportunities he had as an immigrant were so much, I mean, it was difficult, but so much more opportunity than many immigrants have today. He, at the age of 14, got a job in this factory, but he was able to support his mother and sister with the salary that he made. It wasn't, they didn't live well, they were poor, but he was able to support them. How did he become a lawyer? He took, first he started with high school classes. He studied high school subjects one by one on his own at night, and then took equivalency tests one by one. Then when he had completed that, he took a law school qualifying exam, got a law school qualifying certificate, and went to law school at night. It was extremely difficult. He worked 10 hours in the factory, ran to law school without time to have dinner, came home at about 10:30 at night, quickly ate dinner, studied for several hours, slept for only a few hours, and then had to do the same thing the next day. But he was able to do it. The classes were a lot of, not a huge amount of money. He was able to pay for it out of his salary. And had it not been for the Depression, he probably would have been able to practice the profession at that point. The feeling that after all these years working on this book, it suddenly came out in this pandemic. I had fantasies about talking about him and talking about the book, looking at all you people in front of me, and now I'm looking at a screen, hoping you're still listening to me. I don't even know. I don't see you. But in some ways, I think it's almost appropriate coming out in the pandemic, because so much about his life was turned upside down by these unforeseen cataclysmic events. His father died of tuberculosis, not the 1918 flu epidemic, but one of his favorite aunts, a beloved aunt, did die of the 1918 flu epidemic. But it was the Depression that was that real, what really took his life off the course that he had hoped for. And I'm sure the pandemic is doing that to so many people today, and it makes me think about that when I think about the effect on his life. I said that I would tell you something about the women that my father might have married instead of my mother. So let me just talk a little bit about that. Also because, well, I just realized that I should say something before I tell you that, because Einstein shows up in my story, and people always want to know about that bit of it. So let me tell you that, and then I'll get to Helen. So as I said, part of what I realized and learned about my father, reading about all the things he had written and talking to him and reading his journals, was, and I think explained to me why he was so obsessed with memories of his childhood in Warsaw, which he was. He talked about it in such astonishing detail and never tired of talking about it. because he had lost that sense of being part of a large family. He was raised in Warsaw with his mother's nuclear family. My grandmother, his mother, was the second oldest of probably 18 siblings. I've heard numbers 16, as many as 23, but I can name 18. 13 whose lives I know their life stories, and I can tell you what happened to them. At the time that my father was born, he and his mother and sister were living in one room in that household. It was part of the Hasidic tradition that when a young couple married, the wife's father would let them live with them for a couple of years, and that was called kestin. It was part of something like a dowry. When my father's father came down with tuberculosis and left the family, they just stayed there. 9 of his mother's brothers and sisters were living there when he was living there, and he spoke with such fondness of he called it the warmth, the liveliness of so many aunts and uncles. And one of his favorite things to do was talk to me about who these aunts and uncles were, and I loved to hear the stories as well. His mother and the sisters were all very educated. The brothers were not, because they had to study religious texts their entire lives. They never learned to speak Polish particularly well, and they didn't get secular education, but the sisters all did. So his mother had the equivalent of a college education, she founded and was the principal of the first school for Hasidic girls in Warsaw and probably in Poland. And one of her sisters, his name was Dora, had studied mathematics and physics in Zurich with Einstein. She became Einstein's lover. She came to the United States. My father visited her with his mother on his way to Antwerp, from where they sailed to the United States. She came to the United States very shortly after they did, and my father remembered hearing her tell her sisters when she arrived about studying with Einstein, and telling them that Einstein had told her that she was one of only 10 people in the world that truly understood his theory of relativity. When Einstein came to the United States and settled in Princeton, she went to Princeton to be with him. She became pregnant with his child, and how do I know this? My father was told by his aunt, one of his aunts. This aunt was a dentist, trained in Warsaw, retrained here, and was the first woman dentist in Newark, New Jersey, and periodontist. She told my father that she had gotten a letter from Dora, who was, I think, the next sister in line after her. She was slightly older, that she was pregnant and was seeking an abortion. The story that I heard was that she believed that Einstein would marry her when his wife died, and when he didn't, she left as far away as she could and went to California, the only family member that went that far away, that left the New York area. Her story ends so sadly, and by the way, no time to go through all the details here, but I do describe in the book how I did verify this story in many ways. And, well, I'll tell you the one most dramatic one, I guess. When Walter Isaacson wrote his book about Einstein, I emailed him and asked if he had come across any reference to my great aunt. And he almost immediately sent me a link to a letter from the Einstein archive, handwritten by Einstein in German, a letter of recommendation for Dora. And he says that I've known her very well for a long time, and she's a brilliant mathematician, physicist, and a talented educator, and he's recommending her for a teaching job. She never got a teaching job in this country, and the last thing I have from Dora, and I will mention it because it's, again, in keeping with this sad insight that I got into the fate of immigrants who often cannot, in this country, create anything like the professions that they had where they grew up. The last thing I have from Dora is a letter that she wrote to her sister shortly after World War II from California, saying that she has hit upon a way to support herself. She is crocheting baby jackets. And if she can break into the Hollywood market, people are praising her work very much. She knows that if she could break into the Hollywood market, she would be able to do very well selling these jackets. So really, really sad ending, I think, to clearly a remarkable woman. Oh dear, I was going to stop at 10:45. I guess I'll go another couple minutes and just tell you about Helen. So my father and mother both said she was not a secret. They referred to Helen as my mother's rival. They both said to me at different times, had my father known that Helen was not a virgin, he had dated her for 3 years, and he thought she was a virgin. Had he known she was not, he discovered that she was not after he married my mother. He apparently got a card from her saying that, I don't have that card, telling him that she had not been a virgin the entire time. Had he known that she was not a virgin, he would have married her instead of my mother. What an astonishing statement. How could that be? The answer to it is so revealing about what women had to contend with at that time with respect to managing this issue of virginity. My father felt he could not get married because he was responsible for supporting his mother and sister. So there was no way he could also support a wife and children. So he could not get married. He felt that if he had sex with a woman who was a virgin, he would have to marry her. If he didn't, he would be guilty of a terrible, terrible injustice, a grievous injustice against her, because if she were no longer a virgin, no one else would marry her either. Now, we know this isn't true because of the way this story is playing out. But that's why he felt that he could not marry her. How did he come to marry my mother? My mother, as he said, was not his girlfriend. He was really good friends with my mother's 3 brothers. She had come from Russia, and shortly after she and her family arrived from Russia, one of her brothers befriended my father, and then he started hanging around and became friends with her other 2 brothers as well. And so he kind of adopted her family as a substitute for his own. Here, his home situation, it was a really dysfunctional and sad family. His mother was depressed. She never found her identity in this country. His sister had mental problems. And so from this lively, warm Hasidic family of so many aunts and uncles, it was reduced to this very unhappy 3. So he spent all his time around my mother and her family. And so she took a liking to him. And she's the one who told me, it took me a long time to get him. She said, I pursued him for a long time. I was always after him to take me to lunch and take me out. Apparently, the last year they did start having sex. But he still said there was no way he could get married. But she, at some point, became so upset that he wouldn't marry her that she became ill. She was crying from morning till night. She couldn't keep food down. She was losing weight. And he felt it was his fault, and he had to do the right thing. And on short notice, he decided, okay, let's just do it, and they eloped. And I have a chapter about this, and I have to say that chapter is almost like a thriller as I figured out the sequence of how all this happened. How did he happen to be having sex with my mother if he wouldn't have sex with a virgin? Well, clearly my mother wasn't a virgin, and she had told him she wasn't, and so he wouldn't be obligated. And then later the obligation kicked in. I felt at the time when I first heard all this story, and I first heard it from my mother. My father wouldn't have told me, but then when he knew she had told me, he talked about it as well. My first thought was that my mother had tricked him, and I blamed her for that. And I thought, and I actually developed the idea, maybe he would have been happier with Helen. He never would tell me that. I often asked him, well, who would you have preferred if you had to choose? He would never answer. He would always say it didn't matter who you married. What mattered is whether you're married or not. If you're married, you're obligated. You have to have a job. You have to make a living. If you're single, you're free. And that was his dream, that his mother would get married and he would be free. So for a long time, I felt my mother had tricked him, but I really changed my mind, and a lot of other things went into that mind change, and I write about it all in the book. But I ultimately decided and realized, I would say, that my mother actually saved him. He was going to stay in that unhappy situation, supporting his mother, and it was a very unhappy situation, and unhappy for his mother as well. Until she got married. She was never going to get married. And I think my mother gave him a life and gave him that happy family, that warmth and liveliness of a large family, which he did end up really, really loving, and ended up really loving her. I have images of they were married 71 years, and two images really stick in my mind. In their 90s, and they were in a senior residence where they got their meals in a dining room. I was visiting them, and they both were in wheelchairs. He was recovering from surgery. She had fallen. They were sitting with their wheelchairs side by side, holding hands across the wheelchairs. And another scene that sticks in my mind, I was visiting them. He was using a walker by this time. I'm in the living room with my mother. He comes in with his walker, and he doesn't head for the chair that he usually sits in. He heads for my mother, and she said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to go give you a kiss," which he does, and then he goes to his chair. So I think my mother did him a huge favor by pressuring him. He would never have made a decision to get married because he would be happier. Somebody had to make him feel that he was more obligated to her than he was to his mother, and I'm so glad that she did. So I'll close here by saying I feel like by writing this book, I changed the end of my dream. So my father is up there with his head near the ceiling, and I can't get him down, and then I realize how I can get him down, and I tell him that I want to hear his stories about his childhood in Warsaw. And he comes down and he sits next to me and he takes my hand and he tells me his stories. At the end of his life, I think he was about 97, I was having a conversation with my father where we talked about how long he had lived and how long I might live and how I would like living that long. And I said, well, I don't know. I guess I won't know till it happens. And he said, I'll have to talk to you from upstairs. I'll be watching out for you from up there. He died 14 years ago, but I feel that by leaving me all these words and all these memories, he has been talking to me from upstairs. And I feel that by writing this book, I managed to keep him with me and keep those conversations going all those years. And now that the book is done, I get to keep him with me. And I think he's here tonight. Thank you.
That was awesome. I mean, besides the story being absolutely...
I can't hear you.
Can you...
That may have been my fault.
It's okay. I just wanted to say that was amazing. It was of course, a charming tale, but it had everything and it got really juicy there. Now I want to get into that chapter. And we do have quite a few questions. And again, I want to thank you for just being so candid. It felt like...
People ask me, how could I be so candid? And I guess if you're going to spend all those years writing a book, you might as well tell the truth.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm hanging at every word, like you said. It's a thriller. Well, our first question is from Ed, and he's wondering, you had the dream at 30, but were you a child or an adult in the dream?
I was an adult. Yeah, yeah, I was in my 30s. I had dreams like that into my 30s, my 40s. Once I started having these kinds of conversations with my father, they stopped.
And his next question, part two, is did he write anything with the job information about things or lessons he learned from the various jobs?
Oh, that's such a great point. No, no. It
No.
was just, this is what happened. These are the insights I got. These are the things, mistakes I made. Yeah.
Um, our next question is from Kate. She says she had a similar relationship with her father, and I loved hearing how yours played out. I lost my father when I was 12, but his absence continues to be a huge in my life. I wonder about the relationship your siblings had with him. Did they have different ideas about him and your parents or marriage, or much the same?
That is a great question. So I have two sisters. My oldest sister, who's 8 years older, her name is Naomi. She had similar feelings about my father to the feelings I had. Much to my chagrin, she had him to herself for 6 whole years before Mimi was born, 8 years before I was born, and her memories as a child are of time with him because he either it was the depression, he was underemployed or normally employed, so she had him to herself, and she had stories about how he taught her to argue. They would have debates, and he said she an example she remembered. He taught her to debate by discussing slavery, and he took the obviously wrong side, that slavery was good, so she could take the right side. And he taught her, and you can imagine how envious I was hearing all those stories. But I made up for it. My sister Mimi, my middle sister, totally different. She has much more positive feelings about my mother than about my father. And I have to thank her for often keeping me on the straight and narrow. She will often point out to me where I'm being unfair to my mother and maybe let my father off the hook. But they've both been very generous about my writing this. I think they've appreciated everything I learned. By the time my father was 97 or 8, I actually knew more about his past than he did because there was details he had told me and that he forgot.
That's so funny. Um, Anna Marie is wondering, you mentioned this book took a very long time to write. What do you think that time gave, what do you think that time gave to the writing process, and how is the book different because of the time it took?
Um, Well, part of my excitement that it's finally done is because it took me so long. I began to fear whether I would ever write it, and I had promised my father I would write it. So I was terrified that something would happen to me before I wrote it and I wouldn't keep my promise. Um, I started out thinking I was just going to be a biography of my father. I resisted thinking of it as a memoir. But the more I worked on it and the longer it took me, I would say the more I accepted the idea that it was also a memoir and that it was also, in many ways, the story of my life. And it went through many drafts. And I would say each succeeding draft had more of me in it. And some of that was my editor, who I think gave me the right advice that I needed more of that. I remember she wrote in quite a few places, "How did this make you feel?" And I thought, what is this, therapy? But she was right. And these things did make me feel things, and it was right to put them in.
That's so great. We have two more questions, but I really just want to share a couple pieces of feedback we've gotten. Carolyn says, totally awesome, Deborah. Thank you so much. The highlight of all author events so far during this pandemic. That's huge.
Thank
Uh,
you so much.
yeah, and thank you guys for sharing that feedback. Kate says, what an amazing man he was. All of this was so rich and complex and fascinating. Thank you.
Thank
So
you so much.
Kate also has a question. She says, was the length of time not also maybe a way of prolonging your time with him?
Thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely. I actually write in the beginning that I think maybe I was a bit like Penelope in the ancient Greek myth. Penelope said that she would marry one of the suitors when she had finished weaving this shawl, death shroud for her father-in-law or something, and then at night she would pull it out. So she never finished it and she never had to get married. And I thought, well, maybe I kind of never want to finish this book because it might feel like I would lose my father when I stopped writing it, and I wanted to keep him with me. So that's very perceptive. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And so one last one, I think it's a perfect question to end on, is from Carrie. She says, you obviously learned a lot in writing this book. What do you want all of us to take away from it?
um, well, if there are older people that you know, talk to them. Um, Now, not all older people want to talk about their lives, so this will be an indirect way for me to answer a question that I'm often asked. My mother had no interest in talking about her past. Some people ask me, well, why are you writing about your father? Why not write about your mother? Uh, and I actually did make efforts to ask her. She was very envious of my spending so much time with my father, and I actually had this on tape that she came in one time and said, gee, I'm going to have to think about my life. And I said, yeah, tell me, tell me. Um, and every question I had, oh, I don't know, I don't remember. Uh, I don't know. I don't really have much memory of before I came to this country. And I said, well, do you remember anything about meals? Because my father had these long stories about meals. No. Do you remember any of your friends? No. Can you describe the house you grew up in? Oh, I remember there was a table and chairs. And then she said something, dismissed it, and said something like, no, there was really nothing much. We came to this country. My brothers went to work. I went to work. We always had enough money, and we had children and grandchildren. So, not every older person wants to talk about the past, but many do, and I think it's a beautiful way to connect with them. And I think not too many young people want to listen.
I totally agree with that sentiment. And, just want to thank you again. I know it's 3 hours later there for you. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I'm getting lots of thank yous from everyone. Beverly, what a plus this has enabled me to be with you in Washington without leaving home here in Melbourne, Australia. I'm so thrilled about how international this, program is and how many people have been on this event. So thank you so much. Any last words you want to say before I wrap it up?
Um, I guess, all the books that I've written, the thing that is most precious to me is when people say, um, I saw myself in your books. And I'm beginning to get that about this too. I mean, I would have thought that my father's story is so different, and it really isn't. I am hearing from so many people, like the person who just made a comment, that it reminds them of their parents, of their own lives, and that's very precious to me.
It's so wonderful. And to all of you on the call, and even those who didn't attend, I will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow that will include a shareable link to watch this. It will include the 10% discount code and also links to purchase her latest title as well as previous works. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. And big thanks to you, Deborah. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for coming and
Yeah,
staying to the end if you're still here.
they are. So everyone stay safe, you stay safe and healthy, and hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Thank you.
Great. Have a good evening.
Bye.